Hey gang, welcome back to my channel and welcome back to this series on building my automated expense tracking spreadsheet. Now, if you were here for our last video, you saw me build the initial spreadsheet, decide between two different spreadsheet connectors that could sync transactions from my bank accounts into my file, and then actually do the initial install and setup of my chosen connector, which was BudgetSheet. So if you didn't catch that video, be sure to go there first. It's pretty brief and it's going to provide a lot of important context for today's video, which will get into expense categories and how I'm thinking about organizing those. Okay, so to quickly recap, as part of installing the BudgetSheet extension onto my Google Sheets file, BudgetSheet created these 4 tabs below. And since the last video, I also went ahead and linked all of my spending accounts to BudgetSheet. I did have to upgrade my plan, so I'm currently on the Pro version, which I paid for, by the way. This isn't sponsored. BudgetSheet doesn't know I'm doing this. But yes, so all of my different spending accounts are linked and ready to go. One tab is going to hold all of my transactions from my linked bank accounts, and then another tab is where I keep track of my expense categories. So BudgetSheet comes with its own. And when you link your bank accounts and sync your transactions over, the transactions get automatically categorized for you. So before I went in and started messing around, I first wanted to just quickly understand how that categorizing worked and how much control I would have over being able to switch out the logic. So to figure that out, I asked Gemini, which is basically Google's version of ChatGPT, just to get a better understanding of how does this extension work and how does it know how to categorize my transactions. So as I was reading, I realized that the categorization actually happens on the Plaid side. So if you remember from the last video, BudgetSheet uses Plaid, which is a third-party connector basically, to sync data from my bank accounts to my spreadsheet file. So it looked like Plaid was the one that was actually responsible for that categorization before it even hit my spreadsheet. But it also seemed that even though that was the case, I should be able to both adjust what those categories looked like if I wanted to, and most importantly, add new categories that BudgetSheet and Plaid may not necessarily use or know what to do with. So after going back and forth a little bit with Gemini, just asking more questions, I felt good about going into my categorization project. So the very first thing I did was I grabbed a list of categories that I had used in my previous spreadsheet system just because it mostly captured what I'm still currently interested in tracking. And if you remember from my last video, I had mentioned that in my last manual spreadsheet, I was able to build some automatic categorizing using custom Google Apps script code. So I also opened that code base just to pluck the logic for those matching rules and be able to translate some of them back into my new spreadsheet. So here I am just opening that code, selecting it all, copying and pasting it into my new spreadsheet file. If you have no idea what you're looking at right now or what I'm talking about, that's totally okay. You don't need to for this video. Okay, so back in my spreadsheet file, in the BudgetSheet categories tab, the very first thing that I wanted to do just to help me make sense of the categories a little more was to assign each category to a bucket, one that corresponded to the bucket system I was using in my previous spreadsheet. Now, you don't have to do this if you're following along using your own spreadsheet. This was mainly a helpful way for me to gauge what categories were already present, which ones of mine were missing, and what did I really want to carry over from my old system into this new one. Now, gang, just a quick note on my category methodology, which I can probably get into in a separate video. But the short version is that my categories list has really evolved throughout the years. And I acknowledge that if you're just starting out, it's a little long and probably overkill. But for me at this point in my life, my expense categories are a reflection of what I'm interested in learning about myself and my spending. So for example, the fact that I have 5 or 6 food categories is probably a bit much. But for me, having a bigger chunk of my food come from groceries that I buy and cook is one of my goals. And so is making sure that I'm not spending too much out on alcohol and drinking. Not that I drink that much, but just saying. So I wouldn't rack your brain trying to figure out what all those nuanced categories are for yourself now. I would say start small like I did, add on as you go, and just think about what are the things about your spending that you want to be able to easily call out. But back to spreadsheet talk. I also just wanted a way to keep tabs on which categories came native to the budget sheet install. So I just added some checkboxes in this column and then checked them off so that I could just have the reference as I began adding new categories to this list. So once I bucketed all the existing categories, my next step was to begin adding the categories that I felt were missing. Now, to be totally honest here, I did not do this in the neatest way. It looks a little haphazard. And I also wasn't confident that I could remove any of the existing budget sheet categories without messing something up completely. So my strategy was to keep everything that came with budget sheet and then to add my categories into that, even if that meant there was some duplicity. Again, you really don't need to do this. I actually think the budget sheet categories alone are a fine starting point. I'm just super particular about my expense tracking. That's all. Okay, so once I had my full list of categories and all of my transactions across all of my spending accounts were synced, the next thing I focused on were those match patterns. So basically in column C here, if you enter the text as it appears in your transactions tab, Budget Sheet will know to check for that text and assign it the category you decide, which is super great and convenient and basically replaces that bit of code that I copied and pasted from earlier in the video. But before I dug in though, I realized that the one thing I wasn't sure about was whether the match pattern feature that Budget Sheet has is case insensitive. So meaning if I type the word Starbucks as a match pattern that I want coded to my coffee shops category, does Starbucks need to be in all caps or lowercase in order for Budget Sheet to register in my transactions tab? So I went back to Gemini and continued our conversation and basically asked about this. And as you can see from the response, Gemini is telling me that the Budget Sheet functionality is case insensitive, which means that it should not matter which letters I capitalize in the word Starbucks, it should always recognize that phrase. Now, as you will see shortly, this ended up not being true. So this is a great real-life example of how generative AI and artificial intelligence isn't always that intelligent. It gets things wrong. So here I am about to try it out. My gym uses a tool called Wodify to manage memberships. So in my transactions, Wodify typically appears in all caps. But for my match pattern testing, I just capitalized the W and then wanted to see if that would automatically update all of the transactions where the word Wodify appears. Once I added my match pattern into the column, I went to the Budget Sheet side panel and ran the category rules again. Now, as you can see, Budget Sheet didn't update any of my transactions. So that told me that entering Wodify with just the W capitalized was probably not going to cut it. So I went back and capitalized all the letters so that it matches how it appears in my transaction. And then I reran the category rules, expecting that it would work. And sure enough, it did. So that told me that whatever match patterns I entered into this column, the case of those letters needed to match how it appears in the description of my transaction. So no problem. Now I went ahead and started to add my match patterns based on the logic that I had in my previous spreadsheet. So a lot of back and forth to make sure that I got the case right and that I, for the most part, got everything that I knew I would want auto-categorized in a particular way. Okay, so once all of my match patterns were updated, I ran the category rules again to make sure that everything was reflected. So for the most part, my automatic categorizing was all set. But going back to my category list, gang, to be honest, I was not going to sleep well knowing how messy this was. Nothing was in alphabetical order or even in bucket order. So I spent a few minutes just reorganizing this whole sheet and basically lumping all of my bucket items together and then sorting within those A to Z. So once my categories were set, the final big thing that I wanted to do was make the categories in my transactions tab just a little more obvious. I like color, gang, and the buckets in my categories tab, having them in their own color just makes it feel a little easier for me to manage and visualize. So I wanted to be able to have that same experience in the transactions tab. So there are a few ways you can do this, but the easiest, fastest way that I landed on was to change the settings in the category dropdown so that each item was assigned its own color. So I did this by selecting the column and basically opening the data validation section, looking for the data validation rule, which data validation here is just a fancy way of saying the dropdown rule. And here you can see each individual category from our categories tab is reflected, and there's this grayish white color assigned to it. So I basically spent a few minutes going down the list and matching each category to a color based on its bucket assignment. And so once I could see colors assigned to my categories, that just made everything feel way more complete. And so one last piece. BudgetSheet automatically syncs data into columns A through G. So I decided to add in column H a reviewed column and basically filled it with checkboxes. And for every transaction that I've reviewed and okayed the category, I'll check this off. Now I haven't tried syncing new data into this spreadsheet yet. So my hope is that once I do that, I won't lose that checkbox data and any new rows that get added will be unchecked, which is my way of knowing that, okay, this is a transaction you haven't seen before, make sure it looks okay. So TBD on how well this part works, we'll see in a future video. And that's a wrap on categories, gang. Stick around for the next video where we really dive into formulas and building out the high-level tracking that helps us make sense of this transactions tab, which I'm super excited about. If this video was helpful, please give it a thumbs up. For more tips and tricks, be sure to subscribe. And if you have any tips for me or questions, please let me know in the comments. Thanks.